Hello. Listen to me as I do a bad shishake. In this episode of this first batch of videos that we are trying to make for our YouTube channel, we would like to sort of introduce you to different products. And this product will be film interpretation, because it's easy to do, so I don't have to read that much. And it's also fun, even if it may be incorrect, but interpretation is always up for interpretation. So the first point I will try to introduce to you the idea from Freud of the return of the repressed, which is an easy to use film interpretive idea that you can use to just piss out film interpretations wherever you go and sound very clever. Then I will use this concept of the return of the repressed to introduce, or rather interpret, the old Spider-Man film with Tobey Maguire, the first one, Spider-Man from 2002. I see that there are some new Spider-Man films too, but the result of their interpretation is not quite as funny, because they do not end with what I call the nice guy problem, which is also sort of a gimmicky meme internet thingy that will hopefully get us many subscribers and stuff like that. So that is why we'll do it in this way. Yes. So we're using a Freudian term, the return of the repressed. Very good, also because the first Spider-Man film is in fact directed by Sam Raimi, whose films are often very Freudian, I think. Some would argue, I would argue that, at least. This is the first line of our thought. This is just the introduction to the terms, the return of the repressed. So the first point is this. Imagine that you're living in a village that faces a great threat by marauders, like evil people on horses or pirates or something like that. Then the village folk get together and they build a wall around the city. What will be the first thing that you tell the children of the village when the wall is constructed? You will say to them, do not play by the wall. This would be a very literal example of the return of the repressed. The scourge of the Mongolians, the threat from the outside, we tried to repress it by building a wall. But then the wall itself becomes to symbolize what we have tried to repress. In this sense, the Mongolian scourge, the threat that produced the incitement to build the wall, comes also to inhabit it symbolically. So the point is this, point 2. Whenever you try to repress something, you cannot do so without coming into contact with the thing that you're trying to repress. In this sense, we might say that atheists have tried to repress Christians by criticizing them and saying that Christianity is no longer a valid religion. But all they have done, in that sense, maybe converting a few, has been to polarize the debate, making the Christians even more certain of their position. Because who likes criticism? Everybody will always be stubborn whenever you criticize them. So that would be an example of a failed attempt to repress something. Point 3. The metaphor of the wall is very apt to us because it explains or hints at the fact that the return of the repressed, that which returns, is actually the very act of repression itself. Our second line of thought, or the return of the repressed as it is or can be seen in Hollywood fiction. The important thing to note, our first point, is that we must be able to say always that there is someone repressing something, which means that when we look at the narrative, we must be able to say that it is the narrative as the story is seen by, for example, the main character. One may be able to establish a connection between the main character and the rest of the plot. And this connection is what sort of, not really though, but sort of legalizes our interpretive efforts in this context. So if I were to provide sort of a formula for the return of the repressed in Hollywood fiction, this is what I would arrive at. The protagonist, which is a fancy word for main character, plus internal uncontrollable element, something inside him that he wrestles with, returns. That is repressed. This is the return. It returns as an overdetermined, external, uncontrollable element or object. In academia, we often use the word object, which can be used as almost anything. Now, third point. The reason I state that the returned element, that which comes back from our repression, our act of repression. The reason I state that it is overdetermined is that it is not necessarily, although it is often a magical object, especially in Hollywood films. And with a magical object, I mean anything from literal magic, such as in Harry Potter, in which an entire universe can be described as that which returns of Harry Potter's own repression. I want to provide some examples of this. We might say that in Super 8, the protagonist's mother has just died. And this, we might describe her death to him as being an internal, uncontrollable object. He cannot consolidate himself with this fact. So, the monster appears as a sort of dead mother, returning as an object he must fight or give call on. There's a very revealing scene in the end of the movie where the locket that his mother gave him must return for some reason with the monster back to space. In this sense, the mother object and the monster disappears and enters into the film at the same time. So there is, at least at a metaphorical level, an associative overlap. Yes. Another example, the iceberg in Titanic arrives and crashes into the ship just as our two protagonists have decided that they are going to leave the ship together. In this sense, we might say that the internal repressed object is the object of class relations that Rose has repressed from herself, thinking that she is now a part of the underclass and the underclass vitality and all that. And we might say that the iceberg is the real of this class relation that comes crashing in and destroys their dream of being together. Now I've provided you with what seems to be a sort of vague, abstract term, and it can also be criticized in a lot of ways, the return of the repressed, especially in this relation to Hollywood fiction or the interpretation of fiction. We might say, for example, that, and this is a very interesting point, that because Freud was so popular in his time, he has actually influenced the way that narrative is constructed today. So we might say that there are some Freudian tropes inherent to the very way in which we create narratives and fiction. So, second point in our third line of reasoning, we could say that it's simply good storytelling practice that the internal conflict of the protagonist mirrors or is mirrored by the external conflict of the drama. That would be a pretty common sense statement that could be used to debunk our use of the return of the repressed. Third, due to the nature of film as a medium, it can be very hard to show the actual internal conflict of the protagonist. So the only real way to tell of it is by hinting at it through external drama. This is basically the same line of thought, but it is also a way that our return of the repressed model could be debunked. Fourth point in this, our third line of reasoning, the internal conflict of the protagonist must necessarily relate to the external conflict of the drama. What we see in the external, we assume to be in the internal. And this leads us also to our fifth point. Due to the nature of the medium of film, as we have already mentioned, we cannot see into the protagonist, not even in dream sequences and stuff like that. We are only told the story through images and sound. This means that we can make our own assumptions about the protagonist's feeling and the way he tackles his inner conflict. And as we know, we humans are very, very prone to see patterns even when there are none. This leads us to our fourth line of reasoning, which is the interpretation itself. I will not, of course, interpret every element of the movie, but I will take whatever I think is funny and as funny as academic stuff gets. I don't even, maybe academic is too strong a word, but this thing that we're doing, yes. And of course, having reviewed the criticism of our terms, the return of the repressed, which I find very apt and to the point, I will proceed to interpret unchecked and without regard to any real principles of the real world. Yes. Spider-Man 2002, Sam Raimi. First point, establishment. Peter Parker lives with his uncle and aunt. He's in love with the girl next door, but she is unfortunately dating a male of much higher quality. And Peter is considered an all-around loser. He can't do much about his situation, as he is a weak character and he has no real personal power to overcome any of the problems that he perceives in his everyday life. That would be the second point. Third point. We now see, if we use a return of the repressed model, that what is repressed in Peter, the fact that he lacks personal power and personal control of his life, which we may speculate is due to the fact that he has no paternal figure and no mother figure either, or he has the figures in the weak example of his aunt and uncle, but his real parents he doesn't know. This repression, or the repression of these elements, return in the form of Spider-Man, who has excessive power. Fourth point. We see then that the lack of control over his personal situation that Peter represses returns in the form of Spider-Man's lack of control over another situation. Fifth point. Those problems that are internal to Peter and are repressed return as external problems to Spider-Man, literal bad guys who wants to beat him up. Sixth point. We see then that what is repressed as a lack of power is inverted as an excess of power. This is the fundamental point, and this is a phenomenon that Freud observed in many of his patients, namely that we humans often convince ourselves when we are in uncontrollable situations which we do not have any power over, that the problem is not our lack of power. The problem is rather that we are so strong and potent that we cannot control our own power. So the seventh point, as the heir of Freud, the French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan would have said, the inferiority of a person, or his personal inferiority complex, is inversed from a point of insufficiency to a point of expectation. One would rather than wallow in the fear of not being good enough, expect to be better in the future. Spider-Man then is Peter Parker anticipating that he will once in the future become stronger and be able to solve his problems. So this is our fifth line of thought on the so-called nice guy problem, where we are going to get all of our subscribers on YouTube, because it's very popular, of course. The situation of Peter Parker reminds us very much of the situation of nice young men with fedoras claiming to be nice young men, or rather nice guys. Point 2. Peter Parker cannot get Mary Jane because he is weak and inferior, and because his social situation sustains this weakness. He has no capacity to change. Point 3. Spider-Man cannot get Mary Jane because he is so strong that bad men just want to fight him all the time, and they're kind of in the way of his progress with that. So, the pertinent question to ask is this: what is the necessity of Spider-Man if he does not solve the problem? Fourth point. Imagine this then. A nice guy goes up to a nice girl and says to her, "I know that you want me, but it is problematic since I am so strong and so potent that we could never be together. I simply have too many problems." The guy saying such a thing would not even need a response for the girl to sustain his fantasy. He would only need to stand there. He would not open himself up to any sort of emotional criticism or anything of that sort. He would be invulnerable, and thus also in this way sustaining his fantasy of actually being invulnerable. So fifth point. In lusting after Mary Jane, Peter Parker makes her, as Jacques Lacan, the famous psychoanalyst, would have said, and yes, I am using Zizek and whatnot, being a copycat and all that, as he would have said, Peter Parker makes Mary Jane his master. She is a measuring stick against which he can measure himself. Whatever she says about him and whatever she thinks about him determines whether he is a winner or whether he is a loser. Peter is caught in an inferiority complex, as we so scholarly can put it, something like that. The thing that keeps him in this complex is, of course, the faint hope that Mary Jane Watson may recognize him, providing him with the authority to tell himself that he is a good person or whatever. So, Spider-Man does not have an inferiority complex at all. To him, Mary Jane is the object in the sense that she does not judge him, but he can take her whenever he wants, except for the fact, of course, that whenever he tries, something comes in the way in the form of bad guys or the problems of the city and whatever responsibility that is. Point 7. Through the act of repression, Peter Parker attempts to make the judgment or the potential judgment that Mary Jane represents to him impotent. The problem goes from being one object, this measuring stick that Mary Jane represents, that reminds Peter how inferior he is, to becoming many objects that he has at least a chance to beat at some point through the actions of Spider-Man. 8. So you see now how the before mentioned line from the nice guy functions. By formulating himself in this way, he does not open himself up to the judgment of anyone. And in this way, the nice guy complex, if we can say that there is such a thing, is an attempt to distance oneself from the judgments that are held against one. So I will shortly push our interpretation a little further and then end with this 6th line of thinking. 1. Peter Parker imagines the masculine figures in Mary Jane's life to be there by intrusion. Her father and her boyfriend, the male that has outdone Peter Parker, being a strong and masculine specimen, are both aggressive figures that, from Peter Parker's point of view, seem to victimize Mary Jane. She does not really love that guy that he is with, and her father is really just kind of a dick, and Peter knows that he would be a better choice along the line. 2nd point, Peter Parker inherits the classical conservative paternal gaze on women, thinking of them as damsels in distress. Peter himself is, as we would say on the streets, friend-zoned like a motherfucker. He poses no threat in the form of sexuality or emotional distress due to romantic commitment or any sort of thing to Mary Jane. He is simply in the friend zone per definition. 3rd point, in this sense we can even speculate that what is really repressed in Peter is his sexuality. This would certainly explain why it returns in the form of white, gooey stuff coming out of the extremities of his body in the form of web. So I've shown you now how we can easily, using this tool, the Return of the Repressed, say a lot of crap about what a movie really means and all that chisel. We can dig a lot deeper, and I could go on and on. Probably the psychoanalytical vocabulary leaves us endless possibilities, and we would never be wrong. Except, of course, if other psychoanalysts looked at our work, they never agree about anything. But anyway, if you like this, please let us know, and if you hated it, let us know that too. We have this idea that maybe if you hate us, hate is still a pretty strong commitment, so you might be able to use that hate to subscribe to our channel at some point. Yes, we would like that. Thank you.